Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us in another story from long ago. Tell me if you'd like, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Comment below and let us know in comment section. Now let's begin. For as long as there have been men and women, there has been tension between them. You see, in the Middle Ages, people believed that women were property. A woman's main purpose was to get married and have children. Doctors were not involved in the birthing process because they believed that doing so would contaminate them. The church also played a role in shaping attitudes towards childbirth. The double standards of the Middle Ages were especially harsh on women. For example, women were expected to be pure and innocent, while men were allowed to have affairs. Women in the Middle Ages were not allowed to own property. Women in the Middle Ages were not allowed to speak their minds. They were expected to be silent and submissive. The church believed that marriage was a sacrament and that it should last until death parted the couple. This meant that a woman who was divorced was seen as being unclean and sinful. She was not allowed to remarry and was often forced to live out the remainder of her life as a nun. This created a lot of problems for women who were in unhappy marriages. They were not able to leave their husbands, even if they were being abused. They were also not able to find companionship or intimacy with anyone else. They were expected to just endure whatever mistreatment they were receiving. This was because women were seen as being inferior to men and were not thought to have the same rights as men. The church was all-powerful in the Middle Ages, and women were not allowed to question its authority. This meant that women were not able to participate in public life. They were seen as being too emotional to be rational and were not allowed to speak on important matters. This also meant that women were not able to defend themselves if they were being mistreated. This was because they were seen as the property of their fathers or husbands. When a woman married, she would become the property of her husband. This meant that women were not able to control any property themselves. Any money that a woman earned would go to her father or husband. This was obviously a very unfair system, but it was the way things were done in the Middle Ages. There were a few exceptions to this rule. For example, a woman could own property if she was a queen or a member of the royal family. Women were also allowed to own property if they were a nun. However, these were rare cases. For the vast majority of women, they were not allowed to own property and were completely dependent on men. Women were judged harshly for having sex before marriage, but men were not. In fact, men were often praised for having sexual conquests. This created a lot of pressure for women to behave perfectly. They knew that if they made one mistake, they would be judged harshly by society. On the other hand, men knew that they could get away with having multiple affairs. This created a very unfair situation for women. They were expected to be perfect, while men were not. Women were also expected to be submissive and obedient, while men were allowed to be wild and unrestrained. This created a lot of tension in relationships. Women were often forced to endure mistreatment from their husbands because they were expected to be submissive. They believed that pain was a punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Women in the Middle Ages were denied a formal education. They were not allowed to attend school or university. Instead, they were taught at home by their mothers or other female relatives. This was done for a few reasons. First, women were seen as inferior to men and were not thought to be capable of higher learning. Second, women were not allowed to own property. And education was seen as a waste of time since they would just end up transferring all of their property to their husbands anyway. Finally, women's role in society was to be wives and mothers, and they were not thought to need an education to fulfill these roles. They were unable to read or write, which made it difficult for them to understand legal documents or contracts. They were also not taught about science or medicine, which meant that they were not able to take care of themselves or their children properly. As such, she could be bought and sold like any other object. Women in the Middle Ages did not have the same rights as men. They were seen as property and were not allowed to own property themselves. This meant that women were completely dependent on their fathers or husbands. They could not make decisions for themselves and were forced to follow the wishes of the men in their lives. Women were also not allowed to vote or run for office. They were seen as inferior to men and were not allowed to participate in politics. Women were also not allowed to hold jobs. They were expected to stay at home and take care of the household. They could not work outside of the home or earn money. This meant that women were completely reliant on their fathers or husbands for financial support. Women were also not allowed to sign contracts or own businesses. They were seen as too weak to handle such responsibilities. In short, women had no rights in medieval society. They were treated as second-class citizens and were not allowed to participate in most aspects of public life. And if her owner wanted to get rid of her for whatever reason, he could do so. As mentioned earlier, women in the Middle Ages were married off at a young age, and they did not get to choose who they married. Marriages were arranged by their parents or guardians, and the bride and groom usually met for the first time on their wedding day. This may seem strange to us today, but it was common practice in the Middle Ages. There were several reasons for this. First, marriages were seen as a way to unite families and create alliances. By marrying your daughter to someone of a higher social class, you could improve your family's status. Second, marriages were often used to transfer property. When a woman married, she brought a dowry with her, which was a sum of money or property that her family gave to her to start a new household. The groom's family would then receive this dowry, which helped them to start their own household. Finally, marriages were also a way to ensure the continuation of the family line. Since women could not own property, they were dependent on their fathers or husbands for financial support. By marrying their daughters off at a young age, parents could ensure that they would be taken care of. Even young girls were sold off, which was terrible because they often had no idea what they were getting themselves into. In some rare cases, women were allowed to refuse a marriage proposal, but this was usually only because they belonged to a higher social class and had more rights than others. But in most cases, women had no choice in the matter. They were sold off like cattle and had to do as they were told. However, it was not always as bad as it is today. The Middle Ages were an especially bad time for women because back then they did not have rights like they do now. If a woman was accused of something, she would have no one to defend her. Women also had to deal with really painful child labor, and there were also rumors that women were witches. All of these things combined made life very hard for women in the Middle Ages. But why were women sold off in the first place? Well, it came down to economics. No painkillers during childbirth. Life was not easy for women in the Middle Ages, especially when it came to childbirth. Back then, there were no painkillers available, so women had to go through labor completely alone. This was extremely painful and dangerous, and many women died as a result. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women in the Middle Ages, accounting for around 40% of all female deaths. Labor was so excruciating that some women bit off their own tongues to stop themselves from screaming. Others went insane or went into shock to cope with the pain. The lack of painkillers also meant that many babies died during childbirth. In fact, around 30% of all children born in the Middle Ages did not live past their first year. This was a heartbreaking loss for the mothers, who had already gone through so much to bring them into the world. Despite the danger, midwives were the ones who assisted women during childbirth. Shunned after divorce. A divorce was unthinkable in the Middle Ages. Women were shunned by society if they got divorced. If you enjoyed this video, check out the previous one. See you next time. Ages. Why did they have it so bad? What was their daily life like? During this time, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa were fighting countless wars, experiencing deadly pandemics, and making some fascinating inventions. For example, when they married, they lost their right to own property and were not allowed to make contracts or sign documents. You might be wondering why they were banned from speaking in church. Well, it's simple. But now let's dive into another interesting aspect of women's lives back then, their clothing. Medieval women wore long, flowing dresses that were often made of wool or linen. These dresses were typically loose-fitting and layered, with a number of layers depending on the woman's social status. The Black Death was a terrible plague that killed millions of people in Europe during the Middle Ages. But how did it affect women specifically? Well, the effects of the plague on women were devastating. After the plague, people began to blame women for its spread. We hope you learned something new and gained a deeper understanding of the challenges women faced during this time period. Remember, if you enjoyed the video, you can give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. They claimed that women were superior carriers of the disease, which led to even more restrictions being placed on them. For example, women were prohibited from attending religious services and were required to stay indoors as much as possible. These restrictions were completely unfair, and they show us how little value society placed on women's lives during the Middle Ages. It's hard to imagine how much strength and courage it took for women to survive the plague and continue on in their daily lives despite these challenges. They truly were the unsung heroes of the time. With so many men dying, women were left to take on traditionally male roles in society, such as farming and blacksmithing. This was a huge challenge for them, since they had no previous experience in these areas. Many women also became widows during the plague, which meant that they had to take care of their deceased husbands' estates, while also dealing with the loss of their partners. Unfortunately, the plague didn't just affect women economically and socially. It also had a devastating impact on their health. Since women were primarily responsible for burying the dead, they were exposed to the bodies of plague victims on a regular basis. This put them at a higher risk of contracting the disease, and many women ended up dying from it. Wealthy women could afford to wear more luxurious fabrics and brighter colors, while poorer women had to make do with darker, more muted tones. During the Middle Ages, men were seen as the strong ones who could handle the physical demands of burying heavy coffins. Meanwhile, women were seen as weaker and more susceptible to the plague, so it only made sense to keep them away from such dangerous work. However, this way of thinking was completely wrong. Women were just as strong as men, and they proved it by stepping up to the plate when their husbands and family members started dying. They took on the responsibility of burying the dead without complaining. But sadly, their efforts were not appreciated, and they continued to be seen as weaker and less capable than men. One of the most important pieces of clothing for a medieval woman was her undergarment, also known as a smock. This was a long white linen dress that was worn under the outer garments and served as both a shirt and a petticoat. The smock was usually made of hemp or flax and was often passed down from mother to daughter. They weren't allowed to read the Bible. Medieval women wore a variety of headdresses, including veils, wimples, and French hoods. Women in the Middle Ages enjoyed a variety of leisure activities. One popular pastime was playing board games such as chess and backgammon. Women also liked to participate in religious festivals and processions, as well as attend theater performances and concerts. In addition, many women found pleasure in gardening, cooking, and other domestic pursuits. During the Middle Ages, women were expected to be skilled in household management, and these skills were often seen as a source of pride and satisfaction for them. Overall, medieval women had a range of interests and hobbies, just like women today. While their lives were undoubtedly challenging, they still found ways to enjoy themselves and make the most of their time. The style of headwear that a woman chose to wear often depended on her age, marital status, and social class. For example, young unmarried women might wear a simple veil over their hair, while married women might opt for a more elaborate French hood. Hats were also popular during the Middle Ages, and women wore them for both practical and decorative purposes. Felt and leather were the most common materials used to make hats, and they often featured decorative elements such as feathers, ribbons, or jewels. Now let's explore the footwear worn by medieval women. They typically wore long, pointed shoes that were made of leather or velvet and were often decorated with buckles or other embellishments. The shape and size of the shoes could vary depending on the latest fashion trends and the wearer as social status. Religious leaders said that allowing women to read the Word of God would be like giving wine to babies, because women were too weak and delicate to handle such powerful knowledge. Can you believe that? This was because they were seen as nothing more than possessions belonging to their fathers or husbands. Medieval women had no control over their bodies. In fact, if they got pregnant, their babies were considered the property of the father. So if the father wanted to, he could take his child away from the mother. And here's where things get really dark. Men were allowed to kill their wives if they suspected them of committing adultery, and there were even special tools used for this purpose. These tools were called the bridle hooks. No, not the bridle hoaxes. They were a set of hooks that could be used to restrain a woman's arms behind her back. The idea was that the woman couldn't defend herself, and the man could punish her without any consequences. Just think about how terrifying it must have been for medieval women, walking around knowing that they could be killed at any moment for something as ridiculous as adultery. This unfair treatment shows us how medieval society viewed women as property rather than human beings. Their role in society was just to obey their male counterparts. In addition, most women were forbidden to read or write, which made it very difficult for them to defend themselves or bargain for better treatment. To make matters worse, if a woman's husband died, she had to remarry within weeks, even though she may have been mourning her deceased spouse. However, while all these things might seem significant at first glance, they don't even come close to being as important as one thing: women's rights. That's right. The reputation of medieval society is so bad that if we mention it, people will think immediately of how poorly women were treated. And what about the infamous Black Death? How did that affect them? If you're ready to embark on this eye-opening journey, then let's get into it. The middle period of medieval history, also known as the Dark Ages, lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. In fact, women had zero legal rights during this era. As if all that wasn't enough, back then, female clergy members were also banned from participating in religious services. But it gets even worse. It's hard to imagine how someone could live like that. But unfortunately, it was a reality for many women during the Middle Ages. Now, let's talk about headwear. So now we know what medieval women wore, but how did they spend their free time? Well, when they weren't working, but let's not forget the biggest challenge that medieval women faced: the Black Death. Now, you might be thinking, why were women the ones tasked with burying the dead? Well, it all comes down to gender roles. But wait, there's more. And that's it for our video on women in the Middle Ages. Women today have more opportunities than ever before. We can vote, own property, and even become the leader of the free world. However, it wasn't this way in the Middle Ages. There was very little courtship, and arranged marriages were very common. A good marriage for a woman meant marrying a man that was older and more established than yourself. Oftentimes, this meant marrying a stranger. From unwanted advances, unwanted pregnancies, unwanted suitors, unwanted marriages. Everything about your life was unwanted by you. You see, women couldn't take legal action against anyone who did them wrong. They also couldn't fight back physically because they were weaker than men. And if they tried to fight back, they would look even more foolish than they already did in the eyes of society. They also couldn't run away because they had no rights. They were considered property, and they could not leave their owner. To make matters worse, women were expected to be submissive to their husbands, their fathers, and even their brothers. If you talked back, you were seen as being a shrew or a bad and difficult woman. And if you were labeled as a shrew, nobody would want to marry you. You'd be stuck alone forever. When two families agreed to marry off their children, And as always, thanks for watching. The groom-to-be would visit the bride-to-be's house and meet her for the first time on their wedding day. While we may think that this is creepy and unusual today, this was the norm back then. It was much more important for a woman to marry well than to marry for love. If she came from a poor family, then she had a better chance of escaping her social class if she married into a wealthy family. If she was an aristocrat, then she could use her marriage to make alliances with other noble families. Oftentimes, women didn't have much of a say in who they married. Parents and religious leaders made the decision for them. Marrying off your daughter was a very important event. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, your value depended completely on who owned you. You see, women couldn't own property. At the time, this was called femme covert. This meant that a wife's property became her husband's property as soon as they were wed. And if she had any money or valuables, they would be turned over to him immediately. But a dowry could make up for this. When a woman got married, her father would typically give her a dowry, which consisted of things like furniture, farm equipment, clothing, and money. The value of the dowry depended on her social class. Poor women had a much harder time getting a high-value dowry, and if she didn't have much to offer, then she would be judged harshly by society. This is why it was so important to marry someone who was wealthier than you. If you were a poor woman who married a rich man, then you could bring a lot of value to the marriage. Your husband would pay your dowry to your father, and then everything would belong to him. This included the value of your virginity. In some cases, if a woman was having sex before marriage, her father would demand that her lover's father pay her a higher dowry, so a woman's virginity was worth a lot of money. And if you weren't a virgin, your father had to make up for it. For most parents, it was a way to get rid of their financial burden because most medieval families lived paycheck to paycheck. If your family was wealthy enough, you could hire servants to help take care of your home. But for most people, daughters had to drop their chores as soon as they hit puberty. And by the time they were 14, 15, they were seen as too old to do housework. So getting them married as soon as possible was a must. Also, men wanted to make sure that the baby really was theirs to carry on their bloodline. If you weren't a virgin when you got married, you were judged heavily by society. Even if your fiancé found out about your promiscuity after you two were wed, he could take you to court and claim that you ruined his reputation. If you were a virgin when you married, you were often given special treatment by your husband and your in-laws. Sometimes women would even fake their virginity by using devices, such as a diaphragm or a sponge on a stick, to prevent themselves from getting pregnant. You might think that these tactics worked, but sometimes they failed horribly. Just ask King Henry VIII. He took 7 wives during his lifetime, and only one of them was actually a virgin. One of his wives, Anne Boleyn, was rumored to have used a diaphragm made out of linen cloth to prevent herself from getting pregnant. However, she eventually gave birth to a girl, and her plan failed. She was later executed by her husband, who desperately wanted a male heir. So if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, you better not have messed around, or you could be next. Men dominated every field, and women had almost no rights at all. Girls were married off young. Medieval marriages were rarely based on love. Dowries decided a woman's value. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, there was no escape. So what do you think? How would you have survived as a woman in the Middle Ages? Let us know in the comments below. Women had it pretty bad back in the Middle Ages. And this is why. As the Dark Ages drew to a close, and we rolled into the Middle Ages, Europe found itself under the rule of the Christian Church. As a result, many of the old Roman laws were swept away and replaced by what has become known as canon law, which was based on the Bible and interpreted by the Church. One of the most common punishments for women was public whipping, which was used for a variety of offenses, including petty crimes such as stealing food, as well as more serious crimes such as adultery. Whipping was a humiliating and painful experience, and women were often left with permanent scars from the punishment. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that women were less intelligent than men and needed to be protected from the evils of the world. Women were seen as property and were not allowed to own property or make contracts in their own name. They were also not allowed to travel alone, but rather to keep them in a subordinate position to men, which made it difficult for them to visit family or friends. And they were forbidden from speaking to men other than their father, husband, or son. This made it difficult for them to interact with anyone outside of their immediate family. Women were also not allowed to read or write, which made it difficult for them to educate themselves or keep up with current events. They were also often kept in the dark about important matters, such as when their husband would be traveling or when they were expected to have a baby. This made it difficult for them to plan ahead or make decisions about their own lives. Because of this belief, women were not allowed to own property or make contracts. They were also not allowed to travel alone and had to be accompanied by a male relative. Women were also forbidden from speaking to men other than their father, husband, or son. In addition, women were not allowed to read or write, and they were often kept in the dark about important matters. All of these restrictions were put in place to keep women safe from the evils of the world, according to the men who were in charge of making the rules. But they also served to keep women in a subordinate position to men. In addition to being physically painful, the public nature of the punishment was also meant to serve as a warning to other women who might be considering breaking the law. The church taught that Eve had been created from Adam's rib to serve him, and that women should therefore be subservient to men. In addition, because Eve had tempted Adam to eat from the tree of knowledge, women were held responsible for original sin. This was because the clothing was seen as symbolic of male authority and power. Women were supposed to wear dresses and other feminine clothing that accentuated their figure. When a woman wore men's clothing, she was accused of trying to disguise herself as a man and deceive others. This was considered a grave offense and was punishable by death. For example, in the year 968 a woman was burned to death in France for wearing men's clothing. In England, a woman convicted of wearing men's clothing could be hanged, drawn, and quartered. That means that the sentence would include being hanged until almost dead, then having the entrails removed while still alive, and finally being cut into 4 pieces. Even female impersonators were put to death. For example, a woman who disguised herself as a man to participate in the Crusades was executed for her crime. Many historians believe that the prohibition on women wearing men's clothing was an attempt to keep women in their place and prevent them from having any kind of power or autonomy. By limiting what women could wear, the medieval authorities were able to control how women presented themselves in public and how they were perceived by others. This was part of a larger effort to keep women subordinate to men and prevent them from having any kind of power or autonomy. Because of this, they were viewed with suspicion and seen as inherently sinful creatures. Women's sexuality was considered dangerous and uncontrollable. Men feared their seductive powers, believing them to be naturally deceitful and lustful. This view of women was held by everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful monarch. And it permeated every aspect of medieval life, restricting women's rights, opportunities, and even their very movement. But there were also other factors at play. Like during the Middle Ages, people didn't really have much going on in their lives. So they created laws against things that nobody really cared about. And when it came to women, these laws were especially strict. Here are just a few of the ways that medieval authorities kept women in their place. No. 3. Domestic abuse was legally ignored. In medieval Europe, women were considered the property of their husbands and fathers, and were often married off at a young age. Marriages were typically arranged, and women had little say in the matter. They were expected to be obedient and submissive to their husbands and fathers, and were not allowed to own property or make contracts. Women who were married off young often became pregnant soon after and were forced to bear children one after another. They were not allowed to use birth control and were expected to continue having children until they were no longer able to do so. If a woman was abused by her husband, she had nowhere to turn for help. In fact, a husband could beat his wife without fear of punishment. The only time a husband could be punished for killing his wife was if he killed her during childbirth. That wasn't because he was a monster, but because it was believed that a woman couldn't die in childbirth without the husband doing something wrong. In addition, if a husband beat his wife and she died, he would be charged with manslaughter rather than murder. Number 2, punishments for disobedience included public whipping. Medieval women were subject to brutal punishments if they were accused of breaking the law. 1. Women could be executed for wearing men's clothes. The wearing of men's clothing by women was forbidden in most of medieval Europe. What do you think? Do you know any crazy laws from the Middle Ages that people don't talk about? Let us know in the comments below. Some people may argue that these restrictions were put in place for the protection of women, but that's not really true. In conclusion, the restrictions placed on women during the Middle Ages were not put in place to protect them. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. The Middle Ages were rough for everyone, but let's be real, women had it the worst. And there are 2 reasons why. First, religious leaders convinced the public that women were naturally sinful. Second, childbirth was awful and usually happened alone on a dirt floor. So grab your wand, ladies, because we're about to wave it away. Eve had eaten from the tree of knowledge and thus doomed all women forever. Mary, however, was special because she was able to resist the temptation to sin. Medieval society was obsessed with female virginity, mostly because men feared that if their wife wasn't a virgin, their child might not be theirs. And God forbid a noble's bloodline end with him. Back then, nobody understood anything about hygiene or germs, so every pregnancy and birth was potentially deadly, often with little or no medical assistance. Pregnant women were not encouraged to seek help from midwives or doctors, because it was believed that this would bring bad luck to the baby. Also, the floor was cold and hard, but it was preferred to a bed because it was easier to move a woman into a squatting position, which was believed to facilitate delivery. Most babies were born during the night, so mothers had to go into labor alone. When morning came and the baby was delivered, family members and neighbors would help clean the mother and the baby. Sometimes women would have a female family member assist them during childbirth. When it came to actually giving birth, medieval medicine had little to offer. Doctors thought that babies could be extracted through the vagina with a pair of forceps, kind of like pulling a stubborn cork from a bottle. Obviously, this was extremely painful for women. And if it didn't work, which it often didn't, the doctor would try to turn the baby to extract it. They would do this by inserting a finger into the vagina and pushing against the baby's head. This was called version, and it was about as unpleasant as it sounds. After the baby was finally born, it would be immediately placed in a vinegar salt solution to stimulate breathing. As you can see, childbirth was truly a nightmarish experience for medieval women. It was dirty, painful, and often deadly. And that's why women had it the worst in the Middle Ages. Add to that the fact that it was normal for women to have children alone on a dirt floor, and you have a perfect recipe for disaster. And while you're down there, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching. Male anxiety about female sexuality led to a number of strange practices. For example, virginity testing, which was extremely painful and humiliating. It involved inserting fingers or a small stick into the vagina to determine whether the hymen was intact. If the hymen was not intact, the girl was considered impure. But this wasn't just a thing that happened before marriage. Virginity tests were also performed on suspected prostitutes. If a woman passed the test, she was deemed innocent. And to ensure the results were accurate, the examiners were often male religious figures. Go figure. These examinations were not only inaccurate, but dangerous for women. And the pain and humiliation they caused often led to psychological trauma. This meant that for medieval women, purity was everything. They came up with all kinds of crazy rules and restrictions to make sure women covered up when in public. Most medieval schools were run by the church, and they didn't cater to females. Girls could attend Mass and receive basic instruction from their parents, but they were generally not allowed to read or write. This was problematic because the only acceptable profession for a woman was that of a homemaker. But reading and writing were essential skills for anyone wanting to manage a household. Without an education, women were unable to care for themselves or their children properly. Girls were encouraged to learn domestic skills like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. But these skills did not prepare them for life if they were ever widowed. An uneducated woman was completely dependent on her husband and powerless if he abused her. Women were required to wear long, loose clothing that hid their figure. They also had to be accompanied by a chaperone, usually a male relative. All of this was done to prevent men from being tempted by female sexuality. They were expected to be sweet, submissive, silent, and obedient. Anything else would be considered sinful. But this constant focus on female purity was also used as a tool to harass and assault women. These claims could ruin a woman's reputation and even lead to her being banished from a community. During the Salem witch trials, more than half of the accused were women. Often these accusations were the result of personal disputes or jealousies, rather than genuine belief that the accused were consorting with the devil. Being charged with being a witch or a heretic could get a woman killed. And sometimes it happened even when there was no accusation of heresy or witchcraft. If a woman did not behave according to societal standards, she might be publicly shamed, beaten, or killed. In many countries, a woman could be put to death for committing adultery. In fact, the last woman to be publicly executed in England for adultery was in 1908. Today, we're exploring why women had it. Worst in the Middle Ages. It is a truth universally acknowledged that single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Back then, women were seen as weaker vessels for the male-dominated body, and therefore more susceptible to the devil's influence. Female hysteria was blamed on a woman's reproductive organs, which were apparently too close to her rectum. Religious scholars believed that women were prone to fits and could spread disease through their sexual urges. And the best cure for hysteria was marriage. Unfortunately, these teachings often resulted in harassment and violence against women. Religious zealots went as far as to claim that female demons appeared to men in dreams and tempted them with visions of naked women. So basically, it was a woman's fault if a man gave into lust. Or at least that's how Jane Austen started one of her most popular novels, Pride and Prejudice. In fact, it was easier for men to end a marriage than it was for women. Men could easily take a second wife and then send the first one packing. But if a woman wanted a divorce, she needed to prove that her husband was abusive, impotent, or engaged in some other unacceptable behavior. She would need to take her case to church officials, who would often side with the husband anyway. Even if she won, the divorced woman would likely be branded a shrew and struggle to find another suitor. So basically, if you were a medieval woman, marriage wasn't anything like the fairy tale it's made out to be. It was actually pretty miserable. But during the Middle Ages, being married was not always the most desirable option for a woman. If she were to say yes to the suitor her parents selected, she would be signing herself up for a lifetime of servitude. Marriage was more like a transaction than a romance. It was an agreement between families, often decided by fathers, brothers, or uncles on behalf of their female relatives, with little regard for the woman's own wishes. Sometimes marriages were even arranged between two families in order to unite fiefdoms or solidify alliances. The bride and groom might have met for the first time on their wedding day. Marriages could also be a way for men to acquire property, and it was unheard of for a wealthy man to marry a much younger girl who didn't really understand what was happening. Once the vows were exchanged, the bride became the property of her husband. She would live with his family, often in a subservient role to her mother-in-law. Her primary responsibilities would include bearing children, managing a household, and maintaining her husband's property. She didn't have the right to manage her own finances or to make decisions regarding her own or her children's lives. A wife couldn't even beat her husband's children without his permission. The husband also had the right to beat his wife if he felt she deserved it. If you wanted to get out of your marriage, your only option was divorce, and that was very difficult to do. In this next section, we'll discuss how religious leaders created an environment where women were often harassed and assaulted. Religious leaders were constantly preaching that women were naturally sinful. Female hysteria was also a thing in the Middle Ages. As we mentioned earlier, women were expected to remain pure until marriage, and this expectation had dire consequences for female sexuality. Men also used the supposed dangers of female sexuality to control women. Women weren't allowed to do much of anything without a man's permission, but perhaps the most egregious of their many restrictions was the ban on education. The last reason women had it the worst in the Middle Ages was the whole childbirth thing. Pregnancy was incredibly risky, and childbirth was often fatal. Now it's time to hear from you.